establishes the dramatic irony of the entire story. Sarah Mitchell, exhausted from her night shift at the hospital, stops at her morning job at Corner Café. She notices a disheveled man in worn clothes sitting outside in the November cold, shivering. Without hesitation, despite having only $17 until Friday, she buys him a large coffee and a muffin. Never knowing that the homeless-looking stranger was actually James Cartwright, the billionaire who owned the entire coffee shop chain where she worked. She never knew that this simple act of kindness, done without expectation of reward, would catch the attention of a man who had been searching for genuine humanity in a world that only saw his wealth. She never knew that 1 month later, her life would transform in ways she could never imagine. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Dawn broke over the city in shades of gray and gold, but Sarah Mitchell barely noticed the beauty of it. She pushed through the hospital's employee exit, her third shift in 24 hours finally complete, her body moving on autopilot through exhaustion so deep it had become a constant companion. Her shoes, once black and professional, were worn thin at the heels, the leather cracked and splitting along the sides where her feet pressed against them with each step. Her coat, a navy blue thrift store find from 2 winters ago, hung loose on her thinning frame, one button missing near the collar, the fabric frayed at the cuffs. The weight in her shoulders was more than physical tiredness. It was the heaviness of carrying the world alone, of being mother and father and provider all at once, of making impossible choices between impossible options. Sarah pulled her phone from her pocket with fingers stiff from cold, the screen lighting up with reminders that felt like accusations. Rent due in 5 days. Emma needed new winter boots, her toes already cramped in last year's pair. The car was making that grinding noise again, the one that meant something expensive was wrong, something Sarah couldn't afford to fix. She closed her eyes for just a moment, allowing herself one breath of despair before locking it away. She thought of her daughter's face, those bright eyes full of trust and love. And the exhaustion didn't matter. Nothing mattered except giving that little girl a chance at something better. 3 years since David left. 3 years since he walked out with promises to send money that never came. 3 years of silence and struggle. Sarah had stopped waiting for him to help. She'd learned to do it all herself. The November cold bit through her inadequate coat as she walked toward Corner Café, her morning shift starting in 15 minutes. She needed this job. Manager Frank had been patient, more patient than she deserved. But 3 late arrivals this month had tested even his tolerance. She couldn't be late again. The cafe appeared ahead, its warm lights glowing against the gray morning, and Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. The familiar smell of coffee and pastries greeted her as she stepped inside. The morning rush already beginning, customers lined up with their orders and their hurried lives. Sarah slipped behind the counter, tied her apron with practiced efficiency, and pasted on her smile. It was a good smile, warm and genuine-looking, the kind that made customers feel welcomed and seen. She was good at pretending everything was fine. She'd had 3 years of practice. The morning rush ebbed into a brief lull, and Sarah found herself at the window, wiping down the counter with mechanical movements, while her mind wandered to the grocery list she couldn't afford and the bills she couldn't pay. That's when she saw him. A man sat hunched on the bench outside, his body curled against the November cold like he was trying to disappear into himself. His coat was old, the kind of old that spoke of years and weather and hard living, torn at the sleeve where the fabric had simply given up. No gloves covered his hands, and even from inside Sarah could see them trembling, whether from cold or something deeper she couldn't tell. He looked weathered, his face lined with exhaustion and defeat, and there was something in the way he sat, so utterly still, that made Sarah's chest tighten with recognition. She knew that look, the look of someone who had been invisible for too long, who had learned not to expect anyone to see them. Customers walked past him without a glance, their eyes sliding over him as if he were part of the bench itself. And each person who passed without stopping made something hurt deep in Sarah's heart. "Mitchell, stop daydreaming. We've got customers waiting." Frank's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and impatient. Sarah turned back to the counter, smiled at the next customer, took their order with practiced efficiency. But she couldn't stop thinking about the man outside. His trembling hands, his defeated posture, the way the cold seemed to wrap around him like a punishment. Her break came 20 minutes later, and Sarah retrieved her wallet from her locker with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. $17. That was all she had until Friday, 3 days away. Emma needed lunch money for school tomorrow. But Sarah looked out the window again and saw the man still there, still hunched, still invisible to everyone who passed. She made a decision, the kind of decision that came from somewhere deeper than logic, from the part of her that remembered what it felt like to be desperate and alone. Sarah ordered a large coffee at the counter, added a blueberry muffin, and watched $5.67 disappear from her wallet. Frank raised an eyebrow but said nothing, and Sarah was grateful for his silence. She carried the coffee and muffin outside, and the cold hit her immediately, stealing her breath and making her thin coat feel like nothing at all. Sarah approached the bench slowly, not wanting to startle him, and up close she could see details that made her heart ache even more. He was older than she'd thought from inside, maybe early 50s, with gray threading through his unkempt beard and lines carved deep around his eyes. Those eyes were distant, staring at nothing and everything, the kind of stare that came from seeing too much or feeling too little. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said gently, her voice soft as a prayer. The man looked up, startled, his whole body flinching, as if he'd forgotten what it meant to be addressed, to be seen. Sarah held out the coffee and muffin, steam rising from the cup into the cold air like a small offering of warmth in a frozen world. "It's cold out here. Thought you might need something warm." The man stared at her, then at the coffee, and something crossed his face that Sarah couldn't quite name. Confusion, certainly, but something else too. Disbelief, perhaps. Suspicion. The look of someone who had learned that kindness always came with conditions, with prices he couldn't pay. I can't pay you," he said, his voice rough and unused, like gravel scraping against stone. Sarah smiled. And this time it wasn't the practiced smile she wore for customers. This was real. Genuine, reaching all the way to her tired eyes and softening the exhaustion there into something warmer. "I'm not asking you to. Just stay warm, okay?" She placed the coffee and muffin gently on the bench beside him, treating them like the precious things they were, and turned to go back inside where her break was already running short. "Wait," the man called out, and something in his voice made Sarah turn back. Their eyes met, and for a moment time seemed to pause in the cold November morning. "Why?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of 100 questions. "Why would you help me? Why would you see me when no one else does? Why would you give away what you can't afford to lose?" Sarah shrugged, the gesture small and honest. "Because someone should." For a brief moment they stood there, two strangers connected by something as simple and profound as human kindness. And Sarah saw something in his gaze that surprised her. Depth, intelligence, a profound sadness that seemed to echo her own. Then she was gone, hurrying back to her shift, and the customers waiting, and the life that never stopped demanding more than she had to give. The man watched her go, his hands wrapping around the coffee cup like it was something precious, something sacred, something that proved the world still held more than coldness and indifference. The man sitting alone on that bench was James Cartwright, though no one passing would have recognized the billionaire CEO beneath the unkempt beard and borrowed clothes. He held the coffee in both hands, feeling its warmth seep into his frozen fingers, and for the first time in 3 months he felt something other than the vast emptiness that had consumed him since Rebecca died. 3 months ago, in a hospital room that cost more per day than most people earned in a month, his wife had taken her last breaths while holding his hand. Cancer had ravaged her body but not her spirit, and in those final moments she had looked at him with eyes still bright with love and said the words that haunted him ever since. "You've lost touch, James, with real people. Real kindness. Your wealth has built walls so high you can't see over them anymore." He'd tried to protest, to tell her about his charitable foundations and generous donations, but she'd squeezed his hand with what little strength remained. Money isn't kindness. You've forgotten what it means to be human. Her death had consumed him, pulled him down into grief so profound it felt like drowning. He'd walked away from everything, his penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows and million-dollar views, his corner office on the 47th floor, his responsibilities, his meetings, his empire. His board of directors had searched frantically, calling his phone, sending security to find him. But James had disappeared into the city like a ghost. He'd borrowed old clothes from his gardener, taken nothing but cash, and set out to test his wife's words. He wanted to disappear, to understand if anyone would care about him without knowing who he was, without seeing the zeros in his bank account. For weeks he'd walked these streets, slept in shelters, sat on benches and sidewalks, and the answer to his question had been crushing. Everyone ignored him. They avoided him, their eyes sliding past as if he didn't exist. Some had spat at him, cursed him for being in their way, told him to get a job, until this woman, this tired, kind-eyed woman who had given him coffee and a muffin with $17 to her name. James took a sip, and it was just coffee, nothing special. Probably the same blend he'd approved in some corporate meeting years ago, without tasting. But it tasted like humanity, like hope, like proof that Rebecca had been wrong about the world, even if she'd been right about him. He watched Sarah through the window, serving customers with that same gentle smile, and he stopped a passerby hurrying past the bench. "Excuse me, what's the name of this café?" The man barely slowed. "Corner Café. It's a chain." James nodded his thanks, and the man disappeared into the morning crowd. Corner Café. Part of the Cartwright chain. His chain. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah worked the rest of her shift with feet that ached deep in the bones, her smile fixed in place like armor against the exhaustion threatening to pull her under. She'd been back inside for barely 10 minutes when Frank cornered her by the espresso machine, his face tight with irritation. "That homeless guy outside. You gave him food from our inventory." It wasn't a question. Sarah's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. "I paid for it myself, Frank. It came out of my break." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Company policy says employees don't buy food for vagrants. Makes them hang around, bothers customers." Sarah swallowed the words she wanted to say and instead offered an apology soft as surrender. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again." Frank held her gaze a moment longer, establishing his authority, then walked away. Sarah returned to the counter, her smile perhaps a shade less bright. After her shift ended, Sarah ran to her car, praying it would start despite the grinding noise, and rushed across town to Emma's school. She made it with 3 minutes to spare, pulling up to the pickup line with her heart pounding from anxiety and speed. Emma climbed in with her backpack and that smile that made everything worthwhile, chattering about her day and her friend Jessica's new lunchbox. They drove straight to the diner where Sarah worked evenings, and Emma settled into her usual corner booth with homework spread across the table. The cook, bless him, brought her a basket of fries without being asked. The same kindness he showed every evening Sarah brought her daughter to work. Sarah served tables for the next 5 hours, her feet screaming protests she couldn't afford to hear, her smile genuine for customers who tipped well and fixed for those who didn't. She pocketed each tip carefully, folding the bills and tucking them into her apron, counting silently and hoping tonight would be enough. Evening turned to night, and finally they went home to their small one-bedroom apartment where paint peeled from the walls like old skin and the heater barely worked, rattling and coughing out lukewarm air. But Sarah had made it cozy despite everything. Emma's drawings covered the walls, bright crayon sunshines and stick figure families. The second-hand furniture was arranged with care, a throw blanket hiding the couch's torn cushion, a lamp casting warm light over the scratched coffee table. Emma chattered about her day while Sarah made dinner from what lived in the cupboard. Pasta again. Just noodles and butter and a sprinkle of Parmesan. Emma didn't complain. She never complained. After Emma fell asleep in the bed they shared, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with bills spread before her like accusations, calculator in hand. she added and subtracted and divided, trying to make impossible numbers work. The numbers didn't add up. They never did. She thought about the coffee she'd bought that morning, the $5.67 she'd now be short. Was it foolish? But even as she asked herself the question, she knew the answer. She couldn't regret it. That man's face when she'd offered him kindness, the disbelief giving way to something like hope, that was worth $5. That was worth more than $5. The next morning, James returned to the café. Still wearing his gardener's old clothes, still carrying the appearance of a man the world had forgotten. But this time he didn't sit outside on the bench where cold and isolation kept him apart. This time he walked through the door and found a corner table where he could watch without being watched. Sarah was already behind the counter, her movements efficient, despite the exhaustion that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. James watched her work and saw things he'd never noticed in all his years of building an empire. She remembered regular customers' orders before they spoke them aloud, greeting them by name with genuine warmth. "Morning, Mrs. Chen." The usual? She asked about their families, their lives, made small talk that seemed to brighten their mornings in ways that had nothing to do with caffeine. James noticed how she slipped extra cream into the cup of an elderly woman who never asked for it, how she patiently explained the menu to a confused tourist, her voice kind and unhurried despite the line forming behind him. When Sarah came to take his order, James looked up and met her eyes. She studied his face for a moment, and he wondered if she recognized him from yesterday, but her expression showed nothing except professional courtesy. "What can I get you?" James ordered just a black coffee, his voice still rough and unused. Sarah nodded and brought it minutes later, setting it down with that same gentle care she'd shown on the bench. "Let me know if you need anything," she said with that warm smile. And then she was gone, moving to the next customer. James watched her all morning, nursing his coffee long past the point when it grew cold. He watched Frank, the manager, bark orders at her from across the counter, criticizing her speed, her efficiency, finding fault in things that seemed flawless to James's eyes. Sarah took it with grace, apologizing for mistakes she hadn't made, working harder and faster until James could see the strain in her shoulders. His jaw tightened with each harsh word from Frank. He owned this company. He'd built it from nothing into an empire that spanned cities and states, but he'd never visited his cafes, never met his employees, never knew that managers like Frank existed in his organization, wielding their small power like tyrants over people who deserved better. At closing time, James lingered near the door, pretending to read a discarded newspaper. He watched Sarah count her tips in the back room through the partially open door, watched her expression fall as she tallied the meager bills and coins. Not enough. He could see it in her face. The disappointment she tried to hide, the defeat she wouldn't let win. She left minutes later with shoulders slumped beneath that inadequate coat. And James sat in the gathering dusk, wondering what kind of man he'd become, that he'd never seen this before. James returned to his real life, but he didn't announce himself, didn't call press conferences, or reassure his board that the prodigal CEO had come home. Instead, he moved through his penthouse like a ghost, and the space that had once felt like an achievement now felt obscenely large. Every marble surface and designer fixture a monument to excess he hadn't earned. He contacted his head of security privately, a man whose discretion was absolute and whose resources were vast. "I need a full background check on someone. Sarah Mitchell, works at the corner cafe on Lexington." Within hours, a file appeared on James's desk, and he read it late into the night, while the city glittered below his windows like scattered diamonds he no longer wanted. Single mother. 7-year-old daughter named Emma. Abandoned by her husband 3 years ago. And he'd left her with his debt along with his absence. She worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, sleeping 4 hours a night if she was lucky. Never missed a rent payment, though the reports showed it was always close, always paid in the final days before late fees accumulated. Emma's teachers reported she was bright, eager to learn, but sometimes came to school tired, wearing clothes that were too small because Sarah couldn't afford to replace them as quickly as children grew. Sarah had no family, no support system, no one to call when the car broke down or Emma got sick. or the impossible mathematics of poverty became too much to bear alone. She'd been Employee of the Month at Corner Cafe twice, but hadn't received the promised bonus either time. James's jaw clenched as he read the notation. Manager Frank had pocketed the money himself, a pattern that appeared to extend across multiple employees and multiple months. James read the file 3 times, each detail cutting deeper than the last. His wife's words echoed in the vast emptiness of his penthouse. "You've forgotten what matters." She'd been right. He'd built an empire worth billions, created shareholder value and profit margins, and quarterly reports that impressed analysts and board members. But he'd lost sight of the people making it run. The Sarahs of the world who showed up exhausted and still smiled, who worked 3 jobs and still found kindness to spare for strangers on benches. Sarah's small act with her last $17 had shown him something his billions couldn't buy, something he'd forgotten existed in the world. Genuine human compassion given without calculation or expectation of return. He made a decision sitting there in the darkness of his too large home. He needed to know more. He needed to help. But how? How did he help without insulting her dignity, without making her feel like charity, without robbing her of the very thing that made her remarkable? The question kept him awake long after he closed the file. Over the next week, James returned to the cafe daily, always in his disguise, always choosing the same corner table where he could watch without drawing attention. He learned Sarah's patterns, saw how she arrived early every single day despite working nights at the hospital. Her exhaustion worn like a badge she refused to surrender to. He watched her save another customer who came up short on cash, a young man fumbling through his wallet with embarrassment while the line grew impatient behind him. Sarah quietly covered the $2.30 from her own tips, waving away his stammered promises to pay her back. He watched her comfort a crying child while the frazzled mother tried to order, kneeling down to the little boy's level and making funny faces, crossing her eyes and sticking out her tongue until the tears turned to giggles. He watched her give her own lunch to a homeless teenager who wandered in, hungry and afraid, pressing the sandwich into his hands, along with a whispered assurance that no one would bother him if he wanted to sit and rest a while. But James also investigated, using his access and authority quietly, and what he found made his blood run cold. The cafe operations were riddled with systematic problems. Managers like Frank were skimming employee bonuses across multiple locations, pocketing money meant to reward hard work. Employee wages had remained stagnant for 3 years, despite corporate profits soaring to record heights. Benefit packages had been cut and cut again to increase profit margins that James had praised in board meetings without ever asking what those cuts actually meant. He'd been too distant, too focused on spreadsheets and quarterly reports, too insulated in his tower to see what was happening on the ground floor. His wife had been right about everything. One afternoon, Emma came to the cafe after school, her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders, and James watched the way Sarah's entire face transformed at the sight of her daughter. The exhaustion fell away, replaced by pure love so palpable it filled the space between them like sunlight. Emma showed Sarah a test, waving it proudly. And even from his corner, James could see the bright red A circled at the top. Mathematics. Sarah's face lit up with joy so fierce and proud, it made James's chest tighten. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." They couldn't afford to celebrate. James knew that from the file he'd memorized, but Sarah made it special anyway, producing a single cookie from behind the counter and breaking it in half so they could share it. They sat together for 10 precious minutes, talking about Emma's dreams of becoming a teacher someday, helping other children learn the way her mother helped her every night at their kitchen table. James watched them and understood with crushing clarity what was at stake. Sarah's car finally broke down completely on a Tuesday morning, the grinding noise she'd been ignoring for weeks giving way to a terrible shuddering, and then nothing at all. She sat in the driver's seat on the side of the road, hands gripping the steering wheel, and allowed herself 30 seconds of despair before calling a tow truck she couldn't afford and figuring out bus routes she didn't have time for. Taking buses meant adding 2 hours to her daily commute between jobs. 2 hours she didn't have. 2 hours stolen from sleep she desperately needed. She started arriving at the cafe later, leaving earlier to make it across town to her hospital shift. And Frank noticed immediately. He called her into his office on Thursday and handed her a written warning, the paper formal and damning. 3 warnings, and she'd be fired. Sarah tried to explain about the car, about the buses, about trying her best, but Frank cut her off with a wave of his hand. Find a way or find another job, Mitchell. I don't care about your problems. Sarah nodded, swallowing the desperation rising in her throat like bile, and returned to work with hands that trembled. That same week, Emma got sick. Just a cold, nothing serious, but enough to need medicine Sarah couldn't afford. Enough to keep her home from school for 2 days. Sarah called in sick to the diner, losing 2 shifts and 2 nights of tips. Staying home to press cool cloths to Emma's fevered forehead and pretend everything would be fine. When Emma recovered, Sarah picked up an extra waitressing shift to make up the lost money. But that meant missing sleep, running on fumes, and missing Emma's school play where her daughter played a flower in the spring pageant. Emma pretended she didn't mind. Said it was okay that Mommy had to work. But Sarah saw the disappointment in those trusting eyes and wanted to break. Sarah was reaching her breaking point, exhaustion etched so deep into her bones it felt permanent. The dark circles under her eyes had darkened to bruises. Her hands shook when she thought no one was looking, and her smile required more effort each day to maintain. One morning at the café, she was so tired her vision blurred at the edges. She picked up a tray of drinks, 4 lattes for a business meeting, and her exhausted hands simply let go. The tray crashed to the floor, ceramic shattering, coffee spreading across the tile like an accusation. Frank exploded, his voice rising above the morning chatter, humiliating her in front of a café full of customers. What the hell is wrong with you, Mitchell? That's coming out of your paycheck. Sarah dropped to her knees, apologizing over and over, cleaning up the mess with shaking hands while trying not to cry, trying to hold on to the last shreds of her dignity. James watched from his corner table, his hands clenched into fists beneath the table, barely containing the anger burning through him. Every instinct screamed to intervene, to stand up and tell Frank exactly who he was and watch the man's face drain of color. But he knew intervening now would rob Sarah of her dignity, would make her feel exposed and pitied. He needed a better plan. James called an emergency board meeting that Friday, his first appearance in 3 months. And the shock on his executives' faces was almost comical. They'd been running the company in his absence, making decisions they hoped he'd approve, worried about stock prices and investor confidence, and the CEO who'd vanished without explanation. James walked into the boardroom in a suit that felt foreign after weeks in borrowed clothes, and he didn't waste time on pleasantries or explanations. He announced changes, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd remembered why he'd built this empire in the first place. Complete audit of all operations. Starting with the café division, mandatory employee satisfaction surveys across every location. Full investigation into management practices and compensation structures. His board exchanged confused glances, uncertain how to respond. Why this sudden focus on coffee shops, their smallest division, barely a footnote in quarterly earnings reports? James didn't explain, didn't tell them about a woman who'd given him coffee when she had $17 to her name, didn't mention the education he'd received sitting on a bench in borrowed clothes. He simply made it clear these changes weren't optional, weren't open for debate, and watched his executives scramble to take notes. He also established something else, working with his legal team through the weekend to structure it perfectly. An anonymous employee relief fund, carefully designed so recipients would never know the money came from him personally, would never feel the weight of his wealth or the obligation of his attention. The selection criteria were written to ensure Sarah would qualify, but random enough that she wouldn't suspect. Meanwhile, at the café, Sarah arrived Monday morning to find a letter waiting for her in her employee mailbox, official company letterhead making her hands tremble before she even opened it. She read it standing in the break room. Read it 3 times because the words didn't make sense, couldn't be real. The company was offering a grant to a randomly selected employee for outstanding service. $5,000. Sarah's vision blurred, the paper shaking in her hands. This had to be a mistake. Some cruel joke the universe was playing. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and called the number listed at the bottom of the letter, expecting someone to laugh and tell her there'd been an error. But the voice on the other end was professional and kind, confirming her identity, congratulating her on being selected, explaining the money would be direct deposited within 2 business days. Sarah made it home before she broke down crying in her apartment, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and desperate. Emma was confused but wrapped her small arms around her mother, holding on tight. "It's okay, Mommy. Don't cry." But these were good tears, relief tears, the kind that came when impossible weight finally lifted. This money meant catching up on rent, fixing the car, getting Emma proper winter clothes with room to grow. It meant breathing room for the first time in 3 years, meant maybe sleeping through a night without waking in panic about bills. Sarah didn't question why she'd been chosen, didn't look for explanations in good fortune. She was just grateful. Sarah's situation improved, but only slightly. And James watched over the following days from his corner table and understood that money alone would never be enough. She fixed her car, arrived on time again, but she was still working 3 jobs, still exhausted, still carrying the weight of the world on shoulders too thin to bear it. The grant had been a reprieve, not a solution. The systematic problems remained like rot beneath fresh paint. Frank was still a terrible manager, still wielding his small power like a weapon against people who deserved better. Sarah deserved better than temporary relief. She deserved real change, real opportunity. A future that didn't demand she sacrifice her health and her time with her daughter just to survive. James made another decision, this one more complex than the last. He would reveal himself eventually, but carefully, thoughtfully, in a way that offered Sarah something that didn't feel like charity, something that respected the dignity she wore like armor against the world. He began restructuring the café division, working late into nights at his penthouse, creating something new. A position that didn't exist yet. Regional employee advocate, someone who would ensure fair treatment across all locations, who would identify exemplary employees and create paths for their advancement, who would be the voice for people like Sarah, who worked hard and deserved more than they'd been given. But he needed the right person for this job, someone who understood struggle not from statistics but from living it, someone who led with empathy because they knew what it meant to need it, someone like Sarah. But first, he needed to help her qualify. Needed to give her tools and credentials that would make the position feel earned rather than given. James worked with his human resources director, someone he trusted, to structure it perfectly. His company offered management training programs, had for years. But they were underutilized and poorly advertised. He had them revamped, made better. Then anonymously sponsored several employees to participate. Sarah's name appeared on the list, carefully buried among others so it wouldn't seem targeted. The invitation arrived at Sarah's apartment on a Wednesday evening, official company letterhead, and she read it with disbelief blooming fresh in her chest. A management training program, evening classes 3 times a week. Certificate upon completion, potential for advancement within the company. So see rained, parm. It seemed too good to be true. Another impossible gift from a universe that had taken so much. But Sarah called the number, confirmed it was real, and this time she didn't cry. This time she felt something fragile and dangerous unfurling in her chest. Hope. She signed up that night, filling out the forms with hands that trembled only slightly. Hopeful but afraid to hope too much. Afraid this dream would dissolve like all the others. Sarah began the training program the following Monday. Evening classes 3 times a week in a conference room at corporate headquarters that felt impossibly professional and intimidating. She learned about management principles, human resources practices, business operations, her notebook filling with concepts that felt foreign and overwhelming. She was nervous at first, painfully aware that she'd never finished college, never imagined herself in management, never thought she belonged in rooms with whiteboards and projectors and people who used words like synergy, and optimization. Brighter than exhaustion and poverty had allowed her to show, and she cared about people in ways that couldn't be taught from textbooks. She asked questions that made her instructors pause and reconsider, brought perspectives from the ground level that MBA graduates had never considered. She excelled. Within 3 weeks, her instructors were noting her performance in reports, impressed by this woman who understood instinctively what others struggled to learn academically. Meanwhile, James watched her progress through those reports, reading them in his office with satisfaction warming his chest. But knowing he needed to prepare for the reveal that was coming, he couldn't hide forever. He consulted with his lawyer about the legal implications, his PR team about public perception, and his board about the business rationale. They sat around his conference table looking confused and concerned. "Why this attachment to a random employee?" his CFO asked carefully. "What's the strategic value?" James looked at them. These people who understood profit margins but had forgotten people, and he tried to explain. "She showed me what humanity looks like when I'd forgotten it existed. She reminded me why we built this company in the first place." They were skeptical, exchanging glances that suggested they thought grief had damaged his judgment, but they trusted him enough not to argue. James planned carefully, methodically, because he knew the reveal needed to be perfect. He would show himself through action, through change that spoke louder than words ever could. He demoted Frank quietly, offered him a position in a warehouse where he couldn't hurt anyone, and brought in a new café manager. Someone kind. Someone who valued employees as humans rather than resources. He implemented new policies across all his cafés, changes that had been needed for years, living wages that employees could actually survive on. Proper benefits, including healthcare and paid sick leave, bonuses actually delivered to the people who earned them. Flexible scheduling for parents who needed to pick up their children from school. The changes rippled through the company like stones dropped in still water. Employees noticed. The cafe where Sarah worked became a happier place, the tension that had lived in the air dissipating into something lighter. Sarah was astonished by the improvements. Grateful in ways she couldn't articulate, but she still didn't connect them to that cold November morning when she'd bought a stranger coffee with money she couldn't spare. The month came full circle with Sarah finishing the training program at the top of her class. Her final presentation earning praise that made her cheeks flush with pride she'd forgotten how to feel. 2 days later, she received a call offering her a promotion. Assistant manager at a larger cafe location across town. Better pay, real benefits, a salary that meant she could finally quit her other jobs and focus on one career, spend evenings with Emma instead of serving tables or cleaning hospital floors. Sarah accepted through tears of joy and relief, barely able to speak the words yes and thank you before her voice broke completely. The day before she started her new position, she received another call requesting her presence at corporate headquarters for orientation. Sarah had never been to a corporate office, had never imagined she'd have reason to enter those gleaming towers where decisions were made and futures were decided. She was nervous, wearing her best outfit that was still modest but clean and carefully pressed. The nicest things she owned that suddenly felt inadequate. She took the bus downtown, watching the city transform from her neighborhood's worn buildings to the pristine glass and steel of the business district. The Cartwright Enterprises building rose before her like a monument to wealth she couldn't fathom. And Sarah stood on the sidewalk for a moment, gathering courage before pushing through the revolving doors. The lobby alone was more luxurious than anywhere she'd ever been, all marble and modern art, and the hushed atmosphere of money moving invisibly through the air. She approached the reception desk with her letter clutched in trembling hands, and the receptionist directed her to the executive floor. The executive floor. Sarah's confusion bloomed into anxiety. She was just an assistant manager, barely promoted, still learning. Why would she need to go to the executive floor? The elevator rose so smoothly she barely felt it moving, and then she was walking down hallways carpeted so thick her footsteps made no sound. A kind assistant led her to a beautiful conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and Sarah sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Hands folded in her lap, trying to calm nerves that refused to be calmed. Then the door opened. A man entered wearing an expensive suit tailored perfectly to his frame, clean-shaven, hair neat and professional, every inch the powerful executive. But something about his eyes was familiar, something in the way he looked at her with an intensity that felt personal rather than professional. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice warm and formal at once. "I'm James Cartwright." Sarah stood immediately, her chair scraping slightly, and shook his hand with a professionalism she'd practiced but never perfected. The name registered. The CEO, the man who owned everything. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Cartwright." James gestured for Sarah to sit, and she lowered herself back into the chair with legs that suddenly felt unsteady. He sat across from her, not at the head of the table where power would dictate, but directly across. Close enough that she could see his eyes clearly. He studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah felt exposed under that gaze, seen in ways that made her uncomfortable. "Do you remember me?" he asked gently, his voice softer than she expected from a man who commanded empires. Sarah looked at him, truly looked, and confusion furrowed her brow. Should she remember him? Had they met at some company function she'd forgotten? James pulled out his phone with careful, deliberate movements, scrolled through his photos, then turned the screen toward her. The image showed a man she recognized immediately. 4 weeks ago, unshaven, wearing old torn clothes, sitting hunched on a bench outside corner café. Sarah's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Recognition flooded her face like sunrise, color draining and then returning in a rush. "You're the man from the bench? The coffee?" Her voice came out barely louder than a whisper, disbelief making the words shake. James nodded, setting his phone down on the polished table between them. "I'm also the man who owns this company. Including Corner Café, including every café in the chain." Sarah's mind reeled, trying to make connections that refused to connect. The homeless man had been the CEO? The person she'd pitied had owned the building where she worked? Nothing made sense. The world tilted sideways, and she gripped the armrests of her chair to steady herself. "I don't understand," she managed to say. James leaned forward, his expression open and vulnerable in ways that seemed impossible for a man in his position. 4 months ago, my wife died. Cancer. Before she passed, she told me something that I didn't want to believe. She said I'd lost touch with real humanity, real kindness, that my wealth had built walls so high I couldn't see over them anymore. His voice carried the weight of grief still fresh. I didn't believe her. So I tested the world. I walked those streets for weeks wearing borrowed clothes, sitting on benches, sleeping in shelters. And nobody saw me. Nobody cared. People walked past like I didn't exist. Until you. Sarah's hands trembled in her lap, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. But I just bought you coffee. That's all. Just coffee. James smiled, and Sarah saw genuine warmth there. Something real beneath the expensive suit and corporate polish. You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me that kindness still exists, without conditions, without calculation. You had $17 to your name, and you chose to help a stranger who couldn't give you anything in return. Sarah struggled to process this, her mind grasping at pieces that wouldn't fit together into a coherent picture. The grant, the training program, this promotion was all of this. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice what felt too enormous to be real. James nodded slowly, holding her gaze. I wanted to help you, but I needed to do it right. Not as charity, but as opportunity. Everything you've earned, you earned through your own merit. The training instructors didn't know who you were or why you were there. They praised your work because it was excellent, not because I told them to. But yes, I made sure you had the chance. Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes, hot and insistent, and she fought to keep them back. Why? Why me? Her voice cracked on the question. I'm nobody. I'm just... James's voice grew thick with emotion, his composure cracking to show the grief and gratitude beneath. Because in my darkest moment, when I had everything money could buy and felt nothing but emptiness, you showed me what actually matters. You reminded me why my wife fell in love with me in the first place. Back when I was building this company in a garage, when I cared about people more than profits. You gave that back to me. You gave me back myself." Silence hung between them, heavy with meaning neither knew how to articulate. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring about professionalism anymore, just trying to see through the tears. "I don't know what to say." James pulled a folder from the table beside him, opened it with careful movements, and slid it across the polished surface toward her. "I'm not just offering you assistant manager, Sarah. I'm offering you something more. Regional Employee Advocate. It's a new position I created. You would work directly with me to ensure our employees are treated fairly, to identify talent that's being overlooked, to make sure no one falls through the cracks the way you almost did." Sarah stared at the contract in front of her, the words swimming through her tears. She forced herself to focus, to read the numbers that seemed impossible. The salary was more than her 3 jobs combined, more than she'd ever imagined earning. Real benefits, healthcare that covered everything, a college fund for Emma that would ensure her daughter never had to struggle the way she had. It was everything she'd dreamed of during those long nights at her kitchen table with bills she couldn't pay. It was more than everything. Part of Sarah wanted to accept immediately, to sign her name on that contract before this dream could dissolve like all the others, before someone realized they'd made a terrible mistake. But another part of her, the part that had learned through 3 years of struggle that nothing came without a cost, feared this was too much, too fast, too impossibly good to be real. "Mr. Cartwright, I'm not qualified for this." Her voice was small but honest. "I clean floors. I serve coffee. I never finished college. I don't know anything about corporate operations or employee advocacy or any of this." She gestured at the contract, at the office, at the world he was offering that felt impossibly far from the one she inhabited. James shook his head firmly, leaning forward with an intensity that demanded she believe him. "You're the most qualified person I know for this position. You understand struggle because you've lived it. You understand what employees need because you've needed those same things. And you lead with compassion, with genuine care for people, which is something no degree can teach and no amount of training can instill." Sarah looked at the contract again, her eyes tracing the numbers and terms that promised a different life. "What if I fail? What if I let you down? Let the employees down? What if I'm not enough? Then you fail," James said simply, without judgment or disappointment in his voice. "But I don't think you will. I've watched you for a month, Sarah. You're smart, far smarter than circumstances have allowed you to show. You're dedicated beyond what any employer has a right to expect. And you care about people in ways that matter. That's what this position needs. That's what matters." Sarah thought of Emma, of her daughter's face when she'd shown her that mathematics test, of the dreams whispered at night about becoming a teacher someday. This position could give them the life she'd fought for: security, stability, the chance to be a mother who wasn't always exhausted, who could attend school plays and help with homework without falling asleep at the kitchen table. But she also thought of other employees like her, working 3 jobs, invisible to the people making decisions, struggling against systems that didn't see them as human. If she took this position, she could help them. She could be the voice they needed. "Can I have one condition?" Sarah asked, lifting her eyes to meet his. James raised an eyebrow, surprise and something like respect crossing his face. "Of course. I want to make sure we help people who need it most. Real help, not just bonuses and policies that look good on paper. I want us to see them the way you wanted to be seen on that bench. I want us to actually care." James extended his hand across the table, and his smile was genuine and warm and proud. "Deal." Sarah accepted the position. She signed the contract with a hand that trembled only slightly, her signature looking small and uncertain on the official paper that would change everything. The next weeks were a whirlwind of change, so rapid and profound she sometimes woke in the night, certain she'd dreamed it all. She moved into a new apartment, still modest because Sarah couldn't imagine living in luxury when she remembered so clearly what struggling felt like. But it was warm and safe and had 2 bedrooms, so Emma finally had her own space. Emma couldn't believe it. running from room to room with pure joy lighting her face, claiming the smaller bedroom as her kingdom, and talking endlessly about how she could decorate it, how her friends could visit, how she could read at night without worrying about keeping mommy awake. Sarah started her new job on a Monday morning, walking into corporate headquarters with her head high despite the nervousness churning in her stomach. She worked directly with James and the HR department, learning systems and structures while bringing her own perspective that no one else could offer. She visited cafes unannounced, sitting with employees during their breaks, talking to them about their lives and struggles and dreams. She learned their stories, heard their frustrations, understood their needs in ways that data and surveys never could. She implemented new programs with James's full support and the company's resources behind her. Emergency funds for employees facing crisis, the kind of help that could mean the difference between homelessness and stability. Childcare assistance, so parents didn't have to choose between their jobs and their children. Mental health support, because poverty and struggle took tolls that couldn't be ignored. Clear paths to advancement for hourly workers who'd been told they'd reached their ceiling. James watched her work with admiration that grew daily. She was everything he'd hoped she'd be, and more. Compassionate but professional. Idealistic but practical. Refusing to let bureaucracy stand between employees and the help they needed. She pushed back when he suggested policies that sounded good in boardrooms but wouldn't actually help real people. She kept him grounded, reminded him constantly what employees actually needed versus what executives thought they needed. They formed an unlikely partnership, the billionaire and the former janitor, working together to change a corporate culture that had forgotten its humanity. The board was skeptical at first, questioning the costs and wondering if Sarah was qualified despite her title. But employee satisfaction scores soared across every location where her programs launched. Retention improved dramatically, saving millions in recruitment and training costs. Productivity increased when people felt valued and supported. Sarah's programs actually saved the company money while helping people, proving that compassion and profit weren't mutually exclusive. 6 months after that cold November morning when a woman bought coffee for a stranger, Sarah and James stood before the board of directors, presenting results that spoke louder than any justification they could have offered. Turnover down 40% across all cafe locations. Employee satisfaction scores at an all-time high. Profit margins holding steady even as wages increased and benefits expanded. The numbers told a story the board couldn't ignore or dismiss. The board members, initially resistant to what they'd called James's grief-driven sentimentality, were forced to admit the approach worked. Sarah, who had once been terrified of public speaking, who had never imagined standing in a room like this with people like them, presented with confidence, born not from arrogance but from conviction. She told stories the spreadsheets couldn't capture. The single father who could finally afford his daughter's asthma medication thanks to better health care, the woman who'd advanced from barista to manager through the new training programs, the employee who'd avoided eviction because of emergency funds that arrived when crisis struck. Lives they'd changed, people they'd seen. One board member, a silver-haired man who'd been particularly skeptical, leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "Miss Mitchell, do you ever regret not pursuing this career path earlier? Think of where you might be now if you'd started years ago." Sarah paused, thinking of her struggles and failures, the nights she'd cried at her kitchen table with bills she couldn't pay, the mornings she'd worked on 3 hours of sleep, the desperate choices between impossible options. She thought of Emma going to school in clothes too small, of choosing which meal to skip so her daughter could eat, of the shame that came with poverty no matter how hard she worked. She said firmly, her voice carrying across the boardroom with absolute certainty, "Because those experiences made me understand what we're trying to fix. You can't help people if you don't understand their reality. My struggles weren't wasted. They gave me perspective no business degree could teach." The board members nodded, some uncomfortable with the rawness of her honesty, others visibly moved. After the meeting ended and the board filed out discussing implementation across other divisions, James walked Sarah to her office. A real office with her name on a placard beside the door, Sarah Mitchell, Regional Employee Advocate. "I never thanked you properly," Sarah said, stopping in the doorway. James shook his head, his expression soft with gratitude and something deeper. "I should be thanking you. You saved my life that morning." They stood in comfortable silence, two people from different worlds who had found connection through simple kindness, who had transformed each other in ways neither could have predicted. Life moved forward, and Sarah's relationship with Emma flourished in ways she'd only dreamed about during those exhausted nights when work consumed everything. She had time now to be present, truly present. Helping with homework without falling asleep at the kitchen table, attending school events without rushing in late from another job, reading bedtime stories that didn't end with her eyes closing mid-sentence. Emma's grades improved dramatically when her mother had energy to encourage and support her learning. She joined after-school programs Sarah could now afford, drama club and art classes, and a science workshop that made her eyes light up with curiosity. Sarah watched her daughter thrive, saw confidence blooming where anxiety had lived, and realized with profound gratitude that this was what she'd always fought for. Not survival, but the chance for Emma to simply be a child with dreams and possibilities. At work, Sarah became known throughout the company, her reputation spreading beyond the café division as other departments requested her input on employee programs. Workers sought her out, trusted her in ways they'd never trusted HR or management, because Sarah had been where they were and remembered what it felt like. She never forgot where she came from, kept a framed photo on her desk of herself in her old café uniform, worn and tired but smiling, as a reminder of why this work mattered. James occasionally joined her on café visits, and employees marveled at the CEO who actually listened, who asked questions and remembered their answers, who had been transformed by one of their own. The media caught wind of the story eventually, journalists digging into the company's remarkable turnaround and discovering the narrative beneath the numbers. Billionaire CEO's transformation after receiving kindness from struggling employee. Sarah was uncomfortable with the attention, hated seeing her struggles presented as inspiration, worried about losing the privacy she'd worked so hard to protect. But James reminded her gently that their story could inspire others, could show people that kindness mattered even when it seemed small and insignificant. They agreed to do one interview, carefully managed, with a journalist James trusted to tell the story with dignity. Sarah spoke about the power of simple kindness, about seeing people as human beings rather than statistics or inconveniences. The segment aired on a Thursday evening and went viral by Friday morning. Sarah's phone filled with messages, her email overflowing. She received letters from people across the country who'd been inspired to help strangers, to buy coffee for someone who looked like they needed it, to look at invisible people and actually see them. Teachers showed the interview to students as lessons about compassion. Companies reached out asking about implementing similar programs. The impact rippled far beyond that one cup of coffee on a cold November morning, touching lives neither Sarah nor James would ever know about, proving that kindness multiplied in ways that couldn't be measured or contained. 1 year after that cold November morning, Sarah stood on the same street corner where she'd first seen a man hunched on a bench who would change her life forever. The café where she used to work had been transformed under new management, the atmosphere inside bright and welcoming in ways it had never been under Frank's harsh rule. Employees smiled genuinely now, their faces reflecting the dignity that came with fair wages and real benefits, and work that valued them as human beings. Sarah was here for the 1-year anniversary celebration, though she'd insisted they make it about the employees and their achievements, not about her story or her role in the transformation. As she stood there, breathing in the November air that felt less cold than it had a year ago, she saw a woman at the bus stop across the street, shivering in a worn coat that offered little protection against the wind, tired eyes staring at nothing. Sarah recognized that look immediately, intimately, the look of someone carrying burdens too heavy and fighting battles invisible to everyone passing by. Without hesitation, without even thinking about it, Sarah walked into the café and ordered a large coffee and a blueberry muffin. She carried them across the street to where the woman sat, and the moment felt like stepping into a memory and creating something new simultaneously. "Thought you might need something warm," Sarah said gently, holding out the offerings. The woman looked up, shocked, her expression cycling through disbelief and suspicion before landing on something fragile and grateful. "I can't pay you back." Sarah smiled, that same genuine smile that had once changed a billionaire's life, and shook her head. "I'm not asking you to." As Sarah walked away, she glanced across the street and saw James standing there watching, a coffee cup in his own hands. He raised it to her in a silent salute, and she nodded back. They both understood now what Rebecca had tried to teach James before she died. Kindness is never wasted. It ripples outward in ways we cannot predict or measure, touching lives, changing trajectories, creating hope where there was none. Sarah returned to her office later that afternoon, to her meaningful work and the programs helping thousands of employees across the company. She went home that evening to Emma, who greeted her with a hug and stories about her day at school. Her life was unrecognizable from a year ago, transformed beyond anything she could have imagined, and it all started with $5.67 and a choice to see another human being. That's the thing about kindness. It costs so little but changes everything. It asks nothing except that we notice the people the world has taught us to ignore, and sometimes, on cold November mornings, it saves lives in ways that ripple forward forever.